Amid the stillness of dawn, in a city that still clung to the illusion of normalcy, I, Morticia, wandered as the shadow of the end. The world around me was beginning to show deep cracks, and even the most vigilant seemed oblivious to the horror slowly blossoming around them. As I walked through silent streets, I prepared myself, patiently, for the storm that would come. For when darkness falls over a city, it devours first those who teeter on the edge, those burdened by unbearable weights and wounded hearts. Thus, the twilight of humanity revealed its first act. In the early hours of that night, a small group gathered at an isolated cafe downtown, far from the hum of night bars and the weekend bustle. It was the usual spot for Luciana, Aline, and Gustavo, longtime friends, and also for a stranger seated at the back, seemingly in search of solitary refuge. Yet this stranger had a distant look, his eyes fixed on something invisible on the horizon. Luciana noticed his unsettling gaze when she passed by to place an order with the barista, and for a brief moment she felt a chill she couldn't explain. Meanwhile, the conversation between the three friends flowed as usual, with muffled laughter and casual confessions. Luciana was an elementary school teacher, and the exhausting day she'd had was evident in her weary expression. She was wondering what it would be like to go home and face yet another night of loneliness, as a recent breakup had left her worn and vulnerable. Aline, an energetic and determined young woman, had faced a life full of challenges. She worked as a nurse at a public hospital, her routine a tangle of exhaustion and dedication. She was used to observing society's deepest wounds, the diseases that ate away at bodies and souls, but nothing could prepare her for what was to come. That night, Aline's eyes were sharper, sensing an underlying unease she herself could not pinpoint. It was as if something whispered in the depths of her mind, a warning that urged her to step out of that cafe. Gustavo was a reserved man, a mystery not only to his friends, but even to himself. He worked in an office, spending his days buried in stacks of papers, but here, with Luciana and Aline, he allowed himself rare freedom. He was, however, a man haunted by the past. The loss of a brother who died young had left him in a spiral of guilt and questioning. That night, his laughter sounded hollow, as if something within him refused to share the moment's lightness. As the group discussed work, the heavy atmosphere in the city intensified, and the first signs of the apocalypse emerged. It wasn't explicit, but the air felt thick, carrying a metallic scent that made them wrinkle their noses. Some customers hurriedly left the cafe, others looked around with palpable discomfort. Then, the stranger at the back of the cafe lifted his head, revealing an empty expression and eyes as dull as shattered glass. He began murmuring something inaudible, drawing looks of astonishment and fear. Luciana, feeling a sudden unease, tried not to stare, but her eyes met his for a second. She felt a chill crawl down her spine, and something inside her told her to get out as quickly as possible. Sensing the tension, Aline tried to reassure her friend. "He's just another lost soul," she said, placing a hand on Luciana's shoulder. "Nothing to worry about. Probably just a drunk man." But deep down, even Aline knew something was terribly wrong. Elsewhere in the city, Rodrigo, a middle-aged taxi driver, drove through empty streets, hoping to find any late-night passenger to end his shift. Divorced and estranged from his children, Rodrigo found solace in the solitude of driving, where he didn't have to confront his choices and regrets. But that night, as he drove, he noticed that the streets were emptier than usual. The radio, always tuned to a news station, struggled to emit any clear sound. It was as if interference had contaminated the air. Rodrigo sighed, assuming it was just an unlucky night, but he couldn't imagine he would soon encounter something far beyond his comprehension. As he watched the road, his headlights illuminating the path, a figure emerged from the shadows, staggering and strange. Rodrigo slowed down, confused and worried. He stopped the car and observed cautiously as the man approached. Illuminated by the headlights, he saw that the stranger's face was covered in blood, with greenish skin and vacant, empty eyes. Rodrigo felt panic rise in his throat, but tried to stay calm and move away. However, as he turned, other bodies began to appear, coming from all directions. Like wandering souls, they roamed the darkness, their breaths ragged and steps disjointed. Paralyzed with fear, Rodrigo hesitated, unsure whether to flee or try to help the seemingly injured man. Then, the nearest figure lunged onto his windshield, screaming in a sound that was not human. Rodrigo recoiled, accelerating the car to escape, while that grotesque figure clawed at any part of the vehicle it could reach. At the cafe, the unease turned to horror when the strange man at the back abruptly stood up and began walking toward the other customers. His steps were uncoordinated, and he seemed to mutter incoherent words. Aline, feeling her nurse's instinct override her fear, took a step towards him. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" But when he turned his face, Aline recoiled. The man's lips were cracked, his eyes entirely lifeless, and a bluish tint covered his skin. He lunged toward her, arms extended, his guttural moan echoing through the cafe. Luciana screamed, pulling Aline away, while Gustavo, in a desperate act, grabbed a chair to try to block the attack. The man staggered toward him, with jerky movements, baring his teeth, drooling a viscous substance. The other customers fled, and the cafe filled with panicked screams. Gustavo, his heart racing, tried to calm his friends. "We need to get out of here. We need to find somewhere safe." Aline, still dazed, nodded, clinging to Luciana's arm. They all ran out of the cafe, but as they crossed the door, they faced the chaos erupting in the streets. The first infected spread through the city, invading establishments and attacking anyone nearby. Sirens from ambulances and police cars mixed with the citizens' screams of horror, and the night, once calm, became a living nightmare. As they fled, Gustavo helped an elderly woman who had fallen, but as he approached, he saw that she too was beginning to change. Her eyes, once human, now showed an animalistic gleam, as if all her humanity had been consumed. Horrified, Gustavo let her go and continued running. Luciana cried, unable to understand what was happening. Aline, once more taking on the role of protector, tried to calm her friend amid the horror. In another part of the city, Isabella, a teenager at home with her grandmother, heard the first rumors of the situation. With her cell phone vibrating incessantly, she watched chaotic videos of people running and fragmented news about attacks. Her grandmother, oblivious to the terror, asked what was happening, but Isabella only tried to reassure her. "Grandma, I think it's just another internet hoax, but we'd better stay locked in here, okay?" The frail, confused grandmother nodded. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to convince herself that it was all just a passing nightmare, but she knew the fear and chaos outside were far too real. Her small, cozy house felt less safe with every passing second. As the city fell into chaos and ruin, the days that followed became long and unending nightmare for Luciana, Aline, Gustavo, and the others who still survived. There was no safe refuge, and every corner hid a new threat. The infected multiplied, dragging themselves in search of life and devouring anyone who crossed their path. By the third day, the survivors found shelter in an abandoned school, desperately trying to keep the doors locked. Luciana and Gustavo, pale and exhausted, leaned against the walls of a dark room, the silence between them more oppressive than any noise from the dead. Aline, her face damp with sweat and tears, watched over the entrance, where a grotesque pile of infected bodies rose, grim and foreboding. Each bore the marks of the horrors they had endured, wounds, empty gazes, and the acrid stench that permeated the air. It was then that Gustavo felt the first twinge of pain. It was subtle, a burning sensation starting in his left arm, yet somehow it seemed to spread like poison through his bloodstream. He tried to hide the pain, clutching his arm, but soon his fingers found a wound he didn't remember getting. Pulling up his sleeve, he saw deep bite marks, already darkened, where his skin was swelling, pulsing with a strange rhythm. Aline, noticing Gustavo's distressed expression, moved closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" He turned pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Aline, I think I was bitten." Aline's eyes widened. The memory of the others who had been bitten, all succumbing over days of fever, hallucinations, and unbearable pain, flashed through her mind with brutal clarity. She opened her mouth to say something, but couldn't. And then came the inevitable question. "How much time do you think you have?" Luciana looked at them both, horrified, tears streaming down her face. "Gustavo, we have to do something." Gustavo nodded, but the pain had already spread, a fire burning in his veins. He felt the scorching heat in his chest, as if his body were being consumed from the inside out. As the hours passed, the fever began to consume him, his mind swinging between sanity and a dark stupor. Time passed slow and heavy, and each second became a more intense torment. As Gustavo drifted between fevered dreams and moments of lucidity, I, Morticia, began to draw near, feeling his soul in decline. He lingered between the world of the living and the dead, his thoughts wandering like a specter, diving into regrets, memories, and illusions. Each night, he muttered confused words, and I watched him, invisible, waiting for the moment when his soul would be ready to cross the threshold. Luciana, seized by despair, couldn't leave Gustavo alone, and so she remained by his side, embracing him and murmuring words of comfort that echoed only in her own grief. Deep down, she already knew Gustavo was slipping into that darkness. In the early hours of the third day, Gustavo awoke with a start. His eyes deeply darkened, and the transformation that had begun now seemed complete. "Luciana," he murmured, his voice a broken whisper, "I don't want to hurt you." Luciana held him, her eyes full of tears. "No, you're going to make it through. You'll be okay, Gustavo." But I, Morticia, knew it was a mistake. He had already crossed the point of no return, and each passing second dragged him closer to the edge. When Gustavo began to tremble violently, the veins in his face surfaced, swollen, marking the path of the relentless virus. Aline and Luciana backed away, but terror gripped them as they watched the life drain from Gustavo, leaving only the shadow of humanity in his eyes. Finally, Gustavo stopped struggling. His breathing slowed, and he looked at me, as if he could see me. I was there, waiting, and with a gentle gesture, I extended my hand to him. Gustavo nodded, resigned, and took my cold hand, feeling the relief that comes with accepting the inevitable. When Gustavo departed, his soul slipped from his body, cold and pale like the last breath of a flame. I looked at him, who was now only an echo of the life he'd once lived, a shadow amid the chaos. As the world around disintegrated, I carried his soul to the rest he had longed for, leaving his empty body behind so the darkness could consume it entirely. Luciana and Aline, now alone, tried to hold the doors against the advancing dead, though they already knew they were surrounded. Aline, fighting until the last moment, held Luciana's hand, and they shared one final look, knowing they would soon meet again at the threshold between the living and the dead. And, amid the horror that ravaged the city, I continued my silent task, embracing each soul that surrendered to the darkness until only silence remained.